Hello, good evening, and welcome back to another episode of Minds on Guard, where we're learning how to guard our minds against all of the manipulations that plague our daily existence here in the 21st century. In last week's video, we did a small dive into what would eventually become the public education arm of the Rockefeller family philanthropy. The Rockefeller Foundation has exerted its power and influence in many varied and quite effective ways throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Education is one area, medicine another, media another, and if we dig into other areas of government and societal development throughout the 20th century, it's difficult to find times where the Rockefellers were not involved in some capacity. The wealth that was amassed by John D. Rockefeller Sr. provided the means by which the personal worldviews and agendas held within the family could be sought and achieved without much, if any, intervention or blocking from opposing entities. The thing to take away from this discussion and this look at the family itself is to seriously consider the influence that is provided to the people of the world who have the financial means to support and further various causes and agendas. We discussed a lot of this in our examination of think tanks, and the philanthropies came up in that series of videos as well. I encourage those watching now to review those videos and think about the ways in which the Rockefellers have been an ever-present entity in our society. Often we hear about the need to preserve democracy and uphold the democratic ideals which make America the example of freedom to the world. Now, while I do wholeheartedly agree that the democratic process is a large part of what provides us with the liberty and freedom to live in a system which provides the most opportunity and the highest standard of living to the widest spectrum of people in history, I do question, however, the motives of many who plead for democracy to rule over our decision-making. There is very often a disingenuous nature to this kind of pleading. That's not to say that the plead is itself bad, far from it, but I ask what is behind the pleas, because we most often hear this kind of thing from politicians and those who are seeking more and more power and influence over people. If this sounds overly cynical, I pose the question, are we truly living in a fully free and diversely representative democracy when the societal decisions like how our education system is run or what policies are enacted over the freedom to do business and grow communities, or even make choices about what kinds of medical procedures we follow, are controlled and directed by a small number of massive financial interests? Can we truly call this system democratic when it's always and only the ones with the highest campaign contributions who get to see their ideals and agendas succeed, while the rest of us, who do not hold the kinds of power and influence that great monetary wealth provides, are left to navigate whatever the powerful have designed for us? The so-called elites of this world seem very focused on maintaining their position in that circle, despite the rose-colored humanitarian altruism that their philanthropic propaganda may attempt to sell us. Are we truly free in today's world, or have we been programmed to think we are? Let's continue our look at the intersection of the Rockefeller wealth and the infusion of experimental psychology into our education system. When we last left this discussion, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had successfully convinced his father to provide the funding to establish the General Education Board. With a donation of over $1 million, the Rockefeller Foundation held a majority stake in the funding and therefore direction of how the board would operate and to what ends they would focus their policies and directives. What drove this new endeavor of the Rockefeller philanthropy was the need to offload their rapidly growing wealth into areas that would provide the means to appear as though they were heavily invested in efforts that would benefit society, thus ingratiating themselves to the masses, as well as provide a safe haven for their money to perpetuate its growth, while remaining protected from forces that might harm the accumulated wealth. This is a tactic of the ultra-wealthy, and one we should all learn to be aware of and approach with a healthy amount of skepticism. Often, large philanthropic organizations are no more than ways for the super-rich to both avoid taxes while funding agendas which maintain their financial stranglehold on policies and governments. The public-private partnership is a major issue, and nowhere was it used to more destructive effect than the melding of the need for public education funding with private philanthropy. In this case, John Jr. saw that the rural South in America was an area where his agendas of autocratic control could begin to truly take shape. At the beginning of the 20th century, the rural South was still going through the reconstruction of their society and economy post-Civil War. This was a time of great poverty and turmoil for many, and the need to attempt to bring the standards of living up in the South to what had been established in the North was clearly apparent to those who were in positions to direct the growth of the region. Most people understand the impact that a well-educated population has on the economic standing of a society. When people have highly developed reasoning skills and logic, they're able to approach reality from a systematic and more accurate direction. The power of understanding truth and the ways in which the world functions is a key to the thriving existence, both at the individual and societal levels. The general consensus was that in order for the schools of the South to rise up to the standards present in the more educated North, they needed to adopt the methods and curriculums that were helping to develop the most prosperous nation in the world. At the time, Teachers College Columbia was one of the most prestigious training institutions for teachers, and they were receiving a large amount of requests for Southern teachers to come to the school and complete their training in New York. In stepped the General Education Board to provide scholarships funding to 6 Southern school teachers to the tune of $300 each. This simple act would set a precedent which intertwined the Rockefeller philanthropy with the future of Teachers College Columbia and the likes of Edward Thorndike and John Dewey. Teachers College was to become the chosen recipient of a major influx of Rockefeller funding, and toward the end of the 1800s, the college was under immense pressure to keep up with the growth of the population of the country. For example, the number of public school enrollments rose from 9.9 million in 1880 to roughly 12.7 million just 10 years later. That near 30% increase meant that there was a desperate need for teachers and institutional expansion. During this growth period, the Rockefellers' General Education Board had promised to pledge $250,000 to aid in repairs and expansion of the college, as well as an additional dollar-matching donation program up to another $250,000 over a period of 2 years. In today's terms, that would be around $16 million in total donations. This meant that in only 10 short years, Teachers College Columbia would become the 4th largest graduate school in the country. Meanwhile, at the same time, this influx of funding was able to bring in what was then considered to be the cutting edge of educational methodology, the educational psychology. The need for teachers, along with the attractive new facilities and methods that were offered at Teachers College, made it the most sought-after institution for training educators looking to fill the needs of the people. Edward Thorndike would publish his masterwork on education just 1 year after the board would set Teachers College at its prestigious level. A few years later, John Dewey would join the scene, and the new progressive education curriculum was ready to be disseminated across the country. With the infrastructure in place, one more piece of the power puzzle would become realized in the person of Abraham Flexner. There's much to say about Flexner's role in directing the Rockefeller philanthropic funds in the fields of education. After leaving the Carnegie Foundation, he joined the General Education Board and became the prime mover for expansion of the funding into new areas which would prove to further expand the sphere of influence of the Rockefeller family. Due to the need for the Rockefellers themselves to remain insulated from public scrutiny, Flexner would serve as the perfect man for the task of rolling out the progressive education and, more importantly, funding for such programs from the board. Flexner was very interested in the melding of European and American schooling, and he believed that a major area where this could have great effects was in the medical field. This played perfectly into the other man behind the Rockefeller money, Frederick Gates. Gates was opposed to the kinds of homeopathic medicine being practiced in America, instead favoring a German approach. This aligned with Flexner's ideas, and after a short meeting, it was decided that the General Education Board would donate $1.5 million to Johns Hopkins University in order to establish a medical school which maintained a chemical-oriented approach to medical treatments. This would pave the way for decades of interwoven research in the fields of chemical medicine with experimental psychology, ultimately culminating in the 1963 production of the behavior modification drug Ritalin, all backed by Rockefeller millions. The mixture of chemically oriented medical practices and experimental psychology was only part of the transformation of the American school system. Eventually, the development of the, quote, modern school of Flexner's visions would be established in Manhattan under the name the Lincoln School. Funded by the General Education Board, the Lincoln School set out with the goal of, quote, construction of new curricula and the development of new methods. Textbooks were created, standardized teaching practices were revised, and the curriculums of Thorndike and Dewey would see the areas of language and reading instruction reduced to ashes of the former methods. Throughout the decades, the materialism of the experimental psychologists took over and removed any inkling of the more traditional worldviews which accepted fundamental truths such as the existence of individual souls and the spiritual nature of reality. Disciples of John Dewey would go on to describe the aims of this new educational paradigm. One Professor Harold Rugg stated that, "Through the schools of the world we shall disseminate a new conception of government, one that will embrace all of the collective activities of men, one that will postulate the need for scientific control and operation of economic activities in the interests of all people. First and foremost, the development of a new philosophy of life and education which will be fully appropriate to the new social order. Second, the building of an adequate plan for the production of a new race of educational workers. Third, the making of new activities and materials for the curriculum." Another man, George S. Counts, proposed that the schools themselves could create the new social order. He said, quote, "Historic capitalism, with its deification of the principle of selfishness, its reliance upon the forces of competition, its placing of property above human rights, and the exaltation of the profit motive, will either have to be displaced altogether or so radically changed in form and spirit that its identity will be completely lost. That the teachers should deliberately reach for power and then make the most of their conquest is my firm conviction. To the extent that they are permitted to fashion the curriculum and procedures of the school, they will definitely and positively influence the social attitudes, ideals, and behavior of the coming generation." With ideologies like these controlling the curriculums and methodologies of American schooling, is it any wonder that we have seen the destruction of the individual capacity for deeper reasoning? The combination of behavior modification drugs and psychological conditioning has left us with a docile, subservient culture that is readily and easily programmed to accept any authority that is thrust upon the underdeveloped minds of our nation's people. What's more, the desire for collectivist social systems creates a codependent and narcissistic culture that is easily swayed by public opinion and the directives of those who have placed themselves in positions of power, legitimately or otherwise. We must wake up to the truth of where we are as a society. We must take up the fight to renew our minds daily. Until next week, stay diligent and stay vigilant, keeping your minds on guard.